September 1978. Norman's Cay, the Bahamas. A hook-shaped strip of limestone and casuarina trees, 210 miles off the Florida coast, population somewhere under 100 people who still had the nerve to stay. A Learjet comes in low over the water, wobbles once in the crosswind, and drops onto a runway that shouldn't exist. 3,300 feet of poured concrete, built where a grass airstrip used to be, long enough to land a plane loaded with more cocaine than the entire Miami Police Department has ever seized in a single year. On the tarmac, a man in swim trunks watches it taxi in. He's got blonde hair, a farmer's tan, and a security detail of Germans with dogs standing behind him like he's some kind of tropical warlord, which, at this point, he basically is. His name is Carlos Lehder, and behind him, half-finished, sits a house he calls the Volcano, stocked with amphetamines, a walk-in freezer full of cocaine instead of fish, and a bronze statue he commissioned of John Lennon, naked, wearing a German army helmet. Bring that image up in conversation, and most people assume you're describing a scene cut from a movie for being too ridiculous. It's not. It happened. And it's one of the more restrained things Carlos Lehder ever did. 10 years ago, Netflix gave you Narcos. 25 years ago, you got Blow, with Johnny Depp playing George Jung and a much smaller, much calmer version of Lehder standing next to him. Both projects show you the island. Neither one shows you the political party. Neither one shows you the offer to pay off an entire country's national debt just to keep himself out of a Florida courtroom. Neither one really gets into the Hitler worship, because how do you put cocaine trafficker with a swastika tattoo who also loved the Beatles into a 2-hour runtime without the whole thing tipping over into something audiences won't sit through? So they trimmed him down. They gave you the eccentric millionaire with the island and the parties, and they left the rest on the cutting room floor. This is the version they left out. Let's start with where he came from, because nothing about Carlos Lehder makes sense if you don't understand his father. He was born on September 7th, 1949, in Armenia, a coffee town in Colombia's Quindio region. Green hills, cool air, small-town money built on beans and mule trains. His mother, Helena Rivas, was Colombian. His father, Wilhelm Lehder, was a German engineer who'd come to South America before the Second World War and never fully left his politics behind him. Wilhelm ran a small inn in town, the Pension Ale Manna, and for a while American intelligence kept half an eye on the place, worried it doubled as a meeting spot for Nazi sympathizers scattered across the Colombian countryside. Whether or not that suspicion was ever proven, the household Carlos grew up in wasn't neutral ground. His father admired Hitler. His father talked about Hitler. And a kid absorbs that kind of thing the way a kid absorbs anything said often enough at the dinner table, as background noise that eventually becomes belief. His parents split up. At 15, Carlos moved to New York City with his mother. And this is where the story stops looking unusual and starts looking almost boringly familiar for a future cartel boss. He dropped out of school, started stealing cars in Queens, ran them down to Michigan, and eventually figured out how to smuggle a few of them all the way back to a dealership his brother ran in Medellin. Small time, local, the kind of hustle that gets a teenager arrested, not famous. He got arrested plenty. Car theft, then marijuana. In 1973, at 24, he caught a 2-year sentence for trying to smuggle 300 pounds of weed inside a fake airplane engine casing, which tells you 2 things about him early. He already had access to aircraft, and he already thought in terms of volume, not ounces. He served that sentence at the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut. And in Danbury, he met a fellow inmate named George Jung, a laid-back Californian who'd been running marijuana into the U.S. by the plane load for years and had a network of pilots and Massachusetts distributors already built. Jung had the infrastructure. Lehder had something Jung didn't, which was a direct line into Medellin, into a cousin of Pablo Escobar's named Gustavo Gaviria, into the raw supply of a drug that in the mid-1970s hardly anyone in the United States had figured out how to move at scale. Marijuana is bulky. A plane load of weed is worth maybe $500,000 if you're lucky, and it takes up a cargo hold. Cocaine, gram for gram, was worth roughly 10 times as much and could fit in a fraction of the space. Jung and Lehder ran the math together in a prison cell and came out the other side with an idea that would eventually put close to 14 tons of cocaine a year through American airspace. Fly it directly. not couriers with balloons in their stomachs, not suitcases carried through customs by nervous women in nice dresses, though that method existed too and Lehder used it early on. Actual airplanes, flying actual cargo loads, point to point, cutting out every middleman between a jungle airstrip in Colombia and a distribution point in Florida. The idea needed a base, somewhere between Colombia and the U.S. mainland, with law enforcement thin enough on the ground that a private airstrip could operate without anybody asking uncomfortable questions. Lehder found it in the Bahamas, an island chain sitting almost directly along the flight path from South America to the southeastern United States, most of it barely patrolled at all. Investigators would later give the whole route a name, the Caribbean Air Bridge. Lehder just called it home. In May of 1977, he bought a house on Norman's Cay for $190,000 in cash. Within a year, he owned most of the island. He didn't buy every property exactly. He bought the ones people were willing to sell, and he made the rest of them willing. Boats had their mooring lines cut in the night for no reason anyone could explain. Cisterns turned up poisoned. One family found their dog floating dead in the water tank. And then, in case anybody was still slow to get the message, a body turned up drifting on a yacht just off the coast. No explanation offered, none needed. People who'd owned vacation homes on Norman's Cay for 20 years packed up and left rather than find out what came after the dog. By the middle of 1978, the island belonged to him in every way that mattered. He brought in a private German security contractor. He extended the old grass strip into a concrete runway over 3,000 feet long, long enough for a Douglas DC-3, long enough for a converted Curtiss C-46 Commando, a World War II cargo plane repurposed to haul cocaine instead of paratroopers. He built refrigerated warehouses along the edge of the tarmac, the kind you'd use to keep fish from spoiling in the heat, except there was no fish. There were pallets of cocaine, kept cool, so the product wouldn't degrade before the next flight north. He put a Colombian flag up on a pole. His men sang the Colombian national anthem, unironically, on a British colonial island in the Bahamas that he had taken over through bribery and intimidation. He hired armed guards with Doberman pinschers to patrol a beach that used to have nothing more dangerous on it than sunbathers. At its peak, investigators estimated 300 kilograms of cocaine moved through Norman's Cay every single day. Some weeks it ran closer to 300 kilograms an hour during the busiest stretches. In $1979, a kilo of relatively low-purity cocaine could fetch somewhere around $800,000 wholesale by the time it worked through the distribution chain, even accounting for the fact that Lehder wasn't collecting full street value on every gram. The math on that kind of daily volume gets absurd fast. Court documents later put his personal income at somewhere between $250 and $300 million a year at the height of the operation. Not the cartel's income, his. He reportedly kept 1 kilo out of every 4 that passed through the island as his own cut for providing the route. 1 in 4, on a business running 300 kilos a day. And what did the island look like while all that money was moving through it? This is the part that sounds invented and isn't. Girls flown in from Medellin by the plane load. Steaks and flowers flown in fresh every week alongside the cocaine, like the whole operation had a catering budget. Naked women driving Jeep Wranglers around to greet incoming pilots. Bonfires on the beach that ran for days. A pilot named Carlos Toro, who worked the route later, described landing there for the first time and getting picked up by a Land Rover with the top down, driven by women wearing nothing at all, and called the whole scene something out of the Old Testament, a modern Sodom and Gomorrah built on a runway. There's a story from the island that tells you everything about the mentality running the place. One of Lehder's pilots flew in a cargo plane loaded with sod, actual lawn turf, to landscape parts of the property. On the way out, empty, the pilot decided to practice a touch-and-go landing, the kind of maneuver you'd use to simulate taking off fully loaded with cocaine. Something went wrong. The plane came down short and crashed into the shallow water off the runway. Lehder, according to people who were there, just shook his head and ordered a replacement plane. The wreck is still sitting in about 10 feet of water off Norman's Cay today. Divers visit it. It's basically a tourist attraction now, a rusted-out Curtiss C 46, sitting on the harbor floor as the only physical monument left to what that island used to be. Walter Cronkite sailed a 42-foot yacht into the harbor in December of 1978 and was politely told the island was closed, then turned away. Years later, at Lehder's federal trial in Jacksonville, Cronkite testified about that afternoon. One of America's most trusted news anchors describing under oath the day he got turned away from a cocaine kingpin's private smuggling base. And Lehder wasn't hiding from the DEA so much as he was mocking them. On Independence Day in the Bahamas, July 10, 1982, with the operation already unraveling, he had his pilots fly low over Nassau and dump leaflets on the crowd below. The leaflets read, in English, Nixon Reagan's Drug Enforcement Agency, go home. He wasn't trying to stay hidden. He wanted the DEA to know exactly who was untouchable and exactly how little he thought of them. Now here's where the story stops being about one island and starts being about the two things the movies genuinely can't fit into their runtime. Understand something about the amount of money we're talking about here. By some estimates, at his peak, Lehder was personally worth well over $1 billion, and that's a conservative read, depending on which year you're measuring. When you have that much cash moving through your hands and no legal way to explain where it came from, you eventually start looking for somewhere to put it that isn't a mattress. For most cartel figures, that meant real estate, front businesses, ranches. For Carlos Lehder, it meant trying to buy his way out of the extradition treaty between Colombia and the United States, and he tried it twice. The first time was in 1978, while Norman's Cay was still fully operational. Lehder reportedly approached Colombian President Alfonso Lopez Michelson with an offer, informal, deniable, but real. He would personally cover Colombia's external debt to foreign creditors, an amount running into the billions, in exchange for guaranteed freedom to keep operating without government interference. The offer went nowhere. Presidents don't sign documents admitting they took that meeting, so there's no paper trail with his signature on it, just the accounts of people who were around the cartel at the time. But the fact that the offer existed at all, that a drug trafficker in his late 20s genuinely believed he had the liquidity to personally underwrite a sovereign nation's foreign debt, tells you something about the scale we're actually discussing. He tried again in 1982, and this time it wasn't informal at all. By then, extradition to the United States had become the single greatest threat to every major trafficker in Colombia, Lehder included, and Pablo Escobar, who had briefly and bizarrely become a sitting member of the Colombian Congress, is reported to have carried a version of the same offer forward on the cartel's behalf. Pay off the national debt. In exchange, kill the extradition treaty, or, at minimum, guarantee that the men making the offer would never be shipped north to face an American jury. It didn't work either. But twice, within 4 years of each other, Colombian drug traffickers believed they had enough cash on hand to simply purchase a country's foreign policy outright. That's not a rumor invented for a Netflix writer's room. That's a documented offer made by men who had genuinely done the math and concluded it was cheaper than the alternative. The second thing the movies leave out is stranger, and it's the part that turns Carlos Lehder from eccentric drug lord into something closer to a case study. By 1980, the Bahamian operation was under mounting pressure. American law enforcement had been watching the island since 1979, when DEA agents tailing an unrelated marijuana smuggler happened to follow him straight to Norman's Cay and got permission from the Bahamian government to start surveillance. That September, Bahamian police finally raided the island with over 260 officers and arrested more than 30 of Lehder's men. Lehder himself slipped away, tipped off in advance, most likely by an official on his payroll. The operation kept limping along for another 2 years under diminishing cover before he finally abandoned Norman's Cay for good in 1982 and retreated to Colombia. And back in Colombia, flush with more cash than almost anyone in the country, Carlos Lehder didn't just buy ranches and bodyguards. He founded a political party. He called it the National Latin Movement, sometimes recorded as the National Latin Civic Movement, headquartered out of a hotel he built called La Posada Almena, named after his father's old inn. On paper, the platform was a strange cocktail: anti-communist, anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist, nationalist, and in an irony that historians still argue over, officially anti-fascist in its stated literature, even as its founder kept a swastika tattoo, denied the Holocaust in interviews, and openly told journalists that Adolf Hitler was his hero. He'd read Mein Kampf as a teenager the way other kids read comic books, and by his 30s he was still quoting it. He commissioned that Lenin statue, the naked beetle in a German army helmet, because in Lehder's mind those were simply his two great idols, revolution and rebellion fused into one bronze monument. No contradiction detected. The party wasn't a joke, and it wasn't small. Historians estimate it drew more than 10,000 followers in Quindio alone, and in 1984 it actually won 3 seats in Colombia's Congress. Lehder had ambitions of running for governor of his home region. He gave interviews railing against American cultural influence, against the extradition treaty specifically, framing his own cocaine empire as a kind of guerrilla economic warfare against the decadence of the United States. He wasn't hiding the ideology. He was campaigning on it. Put that sentence back to back with the rest of his resume and sit with it for a second. A man who ran an industrial-scale cocaine operation, moving 300 kilograms a day, who twice tried to buy out a country's national debt, who kept a bronze idol to John Lennon standing next to his belief in Adolf Hitler, also successfully organized a political movement that won actual seats in a national legislature. State of Grace gave you dismemberment in a bar basement. The Departed gave you a mole inside the FBI. Blow and Narcos gave you the island, the parties the money. None of them gave you the part where the drug lord ran for office on a fascist nationalist platform funded entirely by cocaine profits and got voted in. His downfall started with a bullet that had nothing to do with him directly. On April 30th, 1984, Colombia's Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a man who had campaigned relentlessly against the cartels, was assassinated on the orders of the Medellin leadership. The killing was meant to send a message. Instead, it broke the last political resistance to extradition. President Belisario Betancourt, who had previously refused to hand traffickers over to the United States, reversed course completely. Lehder went straight to the top of the list. Some of his old partners fled toward Panama, toward Manuel Noriega's protection, and eventually toward Nicaragua when that arrangement soured. Lehder stayed in Colombia, increasingly paranoid, increasingly isolated even from Escobar, who by most accounts had grown tired of Lehder's instability, his drug use, his refusal to keep a low profile when a low profile was the only thing keeping any of them alive. On February 4th, 1987, Colombian National Police raided a ranch near the town of Garn, acting on a tip that a number of people close to the cartel believe came from Escobar himself, tired of the liability his old partner had become. They found Lehder on the property and arrested him within hours. By that evening, he was on a plane to the United States. The first major Colombian trafficker ever successfully extradited under the treaty, he had spent nearly a decade trying to kill through bribery, threats, and outright cash offers. His trial in Jacksonville, Florida, in 1988 was, at the time, the largest prosecution of a foreign drug trafficker in American history. Jurors heard testimony describing the Norman's Cay operation in granular detail. The flights, the volumes, the money. Walter Cronkite told them about the day he got turned away from the island on his own sailboat. Lehder was convicted on charges including running a continuing criminal enterprise and drug trafficking conspiracy, and the judge handed down a sentence of life without parole, plus an additional 135 years, a number so absurd it functioned less as a legal calculation and more as a public statement that this man was never, under any circumstance, walking free again. Except he did, eventually, walk free, and the way it happened is its own strange coda. In 1989, the United States invaded Panama and dragged Manuel Noriega back to Miami to stand trial. Prosecutors needed witnesses who could tie the Panamanian dictator directly to cartel cocaine shipments moving through his country. And Carlos Lehder, sitting in federal prison with over a century of sentence stacked on top of a life term, had exactly that kind of knowledge. In 1992, he cut a deal. He testified against Noriega, describing the arrangements that let Panama function as a waypoint for cartel shipments. and in exchange, his sentence was reduced from life plus 135 years down to a flat 55 years. He spent the following decades bouncing through the federal system, mostly at the maximum security prison in Marion, Illinois, and later at a facility in Arizona under something close to witness protection conditions, given the number of former associates who would have loved a chance to reach him. In 1995, a letter he sent to a federal judge complaining that the government had reneged on a promise to eventually transfer him to Germany was read by prosecutors as a veiled threat, and he vanished from public reporting for years afterward, quietly moved and held under heightened security. Appeals came and went. A 2007 push from Colombia's own Supreme Court, arguing his extradition should be invalidated because he'd already served longer than the treaty's maximum term, went nowhere. A 2016 clemency request aimed at the Obama administration was denied. Finally, on June 16, 2020, after roughly 33 years in American custody, Carlos Lehder was released, reportedly suffering from prostate cancer, and deported to Germany, where he held citizenship through his father. He was 70 years old, and in March of 2025, he did something almost nobody expected. He flew back to Colombia. He was briefly detained at the airport in Bogotá, while officials sorted out whether any outstanding warrants still applied to him, and was released once a judge determined the relevant timelines had expired. He's given interviews since then. In some of them, remarkably, he has denied ever having any real connection to Nazism at all, describing his old behavior as a byproduct of heavy cocaine use rather than genuine belief, and criticizing Narcos specifically for inventing swastika imagery he claims was never really his. The historical record, the tattoo, the party platform, the decades of quotes praising Hitler on the record to multiple journalists tells a considerably less flattering story than the one he's telling now, that he's an old man trying to manage his own legacy on the way out. So here's what actually happened, laid end to end, without the runtime constraints Hollywood was working under. A German Colombian teenager who idolized both John Lennon and Adolf Hitler with equal, uncomplicated enthusiasm met a marijuana smuggler in a Connecticut prison and turned that friendship into an idea nobody else had scaled before. Fly cocaine directly. Cut out the mules, cut out the middlemen. He took over a Bahamian island through a mixture of cash and quiet terror, built a runway long enough for a converted World War II cargo plane, and ran an operation moving 300 kilograms of cocaine a day at a personal income north of $250 million a year. He tried, twice, to personally buy off Colombia's entire foreign debt to purchase his own legal immunity. He built a fascist nationalist political party that actually won seats in Congress, while its founder kept a Nazi tattoo and a nude statue of a beetle in the same house. And when the walls finally closed in, he was captured, extradited, sentenced to more prison time than any human being could conceivably serve, and then walked most of it back by handing federal prosecutors the testimony they needed to convict a dictator. Below gave you the island and the money, and let George Jung carry the emotional weight of the story. Narcos gave you a version streamlined enough to fit between other cartel storylines. Neither one had the runtime, or frankly the appetite, to explain a man who wanted to be Hitler and John Lennon at the same time, who thought a national debt was something you could just write a check for, and who ultimately survived his own empire's collapse by becoming the single most useful informant the U.S. government had against a foreign head of state. The real Carlos Lehder wasn't a supporting character in someone else's story. He was the story, and it turns out the truth needed more room than any single film was ever going to give it. If you found this one worth your time, subscribe. We cover a new cartel figure every week, and drop a comment telling us who we should dig into next.